The first time I saw the boat in my driveway, I thought it was a mistake. It was early morning, the kind where the neighborhood is quiet except for the sound of sprinklers and distant traffic. I walked outside with my coffee, expecting the usual empty driveway. Instead, there it was. A huge white fishing boat sitting perfectly in the middle of my driveway like it belonged there. At first I just stared. I even walked around it, half expecting to see a note or maybe a confused neighbor looking for it. Nothing. No note. No owner. Just a massive boat blocking my car from leaving. Now, I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone mostly keeps to themselves. We wave, we say hello, but we're not exactly best friends. Still, nobody in this area owns a boat that big. At least, that's what I thought. After about 10 minutes of standing there confused, a man walked out of the house next door. Tall guy, sunglasses, coffee mug in his hand. He looked at me, then looked at the boat. Then he nodded casually like nothing unusual was happening. Morning, he said. I pointed at the boat. Is this yours? Yep, he replied, completely calm. I blinked. In my driveway. He shrugged. Your driveway's wide. My side's full. I honestly thought he was joking. But he wasn't smiling. He simply walked past me, climbed into his truck, and drove away like parking a giant boat in someone else's driveway was a perfectly normal thing to do. I stood there stunned, because now I had a problem. My car was trapped. I knocked on his door. No answer. I waited 15 minutes. Still nothing. Eventually I had to call a ride to work. The entire day I kept thinking about that boat. Maybe it was just a one-time thing. Maybe he had some kind of emergency. Maybe tomorrow it wouldn't be there. But the next morning, the boat was back, right in the middle of my driveway. And that was the moment I realized something. This wasn't an accident. My neighbor had decided my driveway was his personal parking spot. And if he thought I was just going to accept that, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson. Because what he didn't realize was that I had a very specific set of options. And over the next few weeks, I would end up using one of them. Exactly 23 times. The second morning confirmed it wasn't a mistake. I stepped outside before sunrise, already hoping the driveway would be clear. Instead, the same massive white boat sat in the exact same spot, blocking my car again like it had moved in permanently. For a moment, I just stood there in silence. Then the frustration kicked in. This wasn't just inconvenient anymore. This was deliberate. I walked over and knocked on my neighbor's door again. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. A few minutes later the front door opened and the same guy stepped outside, stretching like he had just woken up from a peaceful night's sleep. He saw me standing there. He saw the boat, and somehow he looked confused. Oh, you needed to leave? He asked casually. I stared at him. Of course I need to leave. This is my driveway. He shrugged again, like we were discussing the weather. My driveway's too small for the boat, he said. It's temporary. Temporary. That word would become his favorite excuse. Temporary until when? I asked. He sipped his coffee. Couple days, maybe. Then he walked past me, hopped into his truck, and drove away, leaving the boat exactly where it was. Again. By the time I got to work that morning, I had already decided something important. This guy clearly didn't think rules applied to him. And if someone believes they can take advantage of you without consequences, they'll keep doing it. That evening when I came home, the boat was gone. My driveway was finally empty. For about 12 hours. Because, the next morning, the boat was back. Same position. Same problem. That's when I started asking around the neighborhood. Apparently, the guy next door, his name was Mark, had just moved in 2 months earlier. And according to another neighbor, he already had a reputation. He parks wherever he wants, one neighbor told me. Blocks sidewalks, driveways, doesn't really care. That explained a lot, but knowing the reason didn't solve my problem. So I tried one more polite conversation. When Mark came outside that evening, I walked over calmly. Listen, I said, I need my driveway. Please stop parking your boat there. He didn't even hesitate. It's just a driveway, he replied. Relax. Then he laughed. That was the moment everything changed. Because the tone in his voice made it clear he didn't think I would actually do anything about it. To him, this was a joke. To me, It was becoming a daily headache. And the next morning, when I saw that boat sitting there again, I finally made a phone call. The kind of call that comes with a tow truck. And that was only the beginning. The third morning was the moment I stopped being patient. I stepped outside just after sunrise, already knowing what I was going to see. The boat, right in the middle of my driveway again. For a few seconds, I simply stood there looking at it. The early morning air was quiet, birds chirping, sprinklers ticking across the lawns, and this giant white boat sitting where my car should be able to leave. But this time I didn't knock on Mark's door. I didn't wait. I pulled out my phone and made a call. The towing company answered almost immediately. Private property towing service. How can we help? There's a boat trailer blocking my driveway, I said calmly. It's parked on my property without permission. The operator asked a few questions. Was the vehicle on private property? Yes. Did it block access to my vehicle? Yes. Did I authorize removal? Absolutely. All right, the operator said. A truck will be there shortly. I hung up and waited on my porch. About 20 minutes later, the tow truck rolled slowly into the neighborhood. Big, loud, impossible to miss. The driver stepped out and looked at the boat. Well, he said, scratching his head, that's definitely not a car. Still blocking my driveway, I replied. He nodded. Private property. Your call. Within minutes he had the trailer hooked. Just as the truck started lifting the boat, Mark's front door suddenly flew open. He ran outside like he had just heard an explosion. Hey, he shouted. The driver paused. Mark marched across the yard toward us. What are you doing with my boat? The tow driver didn't even look surprised. It's parked on private property without permission, he said calmly. Mark pointed at me. He said it was fine. I crossed my arms. No, I asked you to stop. Mark looked furious. You can't just tow someone's property. The driver shrugged. Actually, he can. It's his driveway. Mark's face turned bright red. This is ridiculous, he snapped. The tow truck finished lifting the trailer. Metal chains tightened. The massive boat rose slowly into the air. Mark stood there helplessly watching as the truck began pulling away. Where are you taking it? He demanded. The driver handed him a card. Impound lot. Address is on there. Bring ID and payment. Mark grabbed the card angrily. You're going to regret this, he muttered as the truck disappeared down the street. I simply walked back toward my house. For the first time in days, my driveway was empty. Problem solved. Or at least, that's what I thought. Because the next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee. And there it was again. The same boat, parked in the exact same spot. Which meant one thing. Mark had paid to get it back. And, apparently, he still hadn't learned his lesson. Good thing I had no problem calling the tow truck again. The fourth morning felt almost predictable. I opened the front door, stepped onto my porch with my coffee, and looked toward the driveway. There it was again. The same oversized white fishing boat sitting in the exact same spot, blocking my car like it had been carefully placed there overnight. For a moment, I just shook my head. Mark had already paid hundreds of dollars to get the boat back from the impound lot. And somehow he still thought parking it in my driveway again was a good idea. That told me two things. First, he clearly didn't respect boundaries. Second, he probably thought I was bluffing the first time. Maybe he assumed I wouldn't actually call the tow truck again. He was wrong. I didn't even hesitate. I pulled out my phone and dialed the same towing company from the day before. The dispatcher recognized the address immediately. Boat in the driveway again? She asked. Exactly the same boat, I said. There was a short pause. Then she laughed. All right, we'll send the truck. This time the tow driver arrived even faster than before. When he stepped out and saw the boat, he shook his head in disbelief. You weren't kidding, he said. Nope. He started hooking up the trailer. Just as the truck began lifting the boat again, Mark's front door slammed open. Apparently he had been watching through the window. He stormed across the yard toward us, already yelling. You've got to be kidding me. The tow driver didn't even stop working. Mark pointed angrily at me. You already towed it yesterday. And you parked it here again, I replied calmly. This is harassment, Mark shouted. The driver tightened the chains and began raising the trailer. Actually, the driver said, this is private property enforcement. Mark looked like he might explode. You're stealing my boat. The tow driver shook his head. No sir. You're storing it in the wrong driveway. The boat lifted higher. Metal creaked. Tires left the pavement. Mark paced back and forth, furious. You're going to pay for this, he said, glaring at me. I simply shrugged. Or you could stop parking in my driveway. The truck finished securing the trailer and slowly started pulling away again. Mark stood in the street watching his boat disappear for the second time in 2 days. Neighbors had started peeking through windows now. A few even stepped outside to watch the show. The entire street had front row seats. Mark turned toward me one last time. You think this is funny? He snapped. No, I said, but I think it's effective. The truck turned the corner and vanished. My driveway was clear again. But something told me this situation wasn't over. Because Mark wasn't the kind of person who admitted defeat easily. And as I would soon discover, that boat was coming back. Many more times. By the 5th morning, the situation had become almost routine. I walked outside with my coffee, glanced toward the driveway, and sighed. The boat was back. Same trailer. Same position. Same ridiculous situation. At this point I wasn't even surprised anymore. Mark clearly believed that if he kept doing it, eventually I would give up. Maybe he thought the towing fees would annoy me. Maybe he thought I'd get tired of making phone calls. What he didn't realize was that calling the tow company had already become the easiest part of my morning. I pulled out my phone and dialed. The dispatcher answered almost immediately. Let me guess, she said. The boat, I replied. She laughed again. You might be our most consistent customer this week. Within 20 minutes the familiar tow truck rolled slowly down the street. The driver stepped out, looked at the boat, and shook his head. Round 3, he asked. Round 3, I confirmed. He started hooking up the trailer while a few neighbors watched from their yards. Apparently the story had spread through the neighborhood. People were curious. Some of them even looked amused. Just as the tow truck began lifting the trailer, Mark's front door flew open again. He rushed outside like someone had pulled a fire alarm. You've got to be kidding me, he shouted. The driver barely looked up. Morning again, he said calmly. Mark pointed angrily at me. You're doing this on purpose. I crossed my arms. You're parking on my property on purpose. That seemed to confuse him for a moment. But it's just temporary, he argued. You said that 3 days ago, I replied. The driver finished securing the chains. The boat rose slowly off the driveway again. Metal rattled. The tow truck engine rumbled. Mark paced across the yard in frustration. You're costing me a fortune, he yelled. The driver handed him the same impound card again. Parking somewhere else is free, he said. Mark stared at the card like it personally offended him. Watched from their porches. One guy across the street actually started clapping quietly. Mark looked ready to explode. This isn't over, he snapped at me. I simply nodded. I agree. Because by that point I had started keeping track. 3 tows so far, and something told me the number wasn't going to stop there. Over the next few weeks, the same routine would repeat again. And again, and again, until eventually the total number of times that boat got towed reached a number that even surprised the tow company. 23. But Mark still hadn't learned his lesson yet. And the next move he made would turn this driveway battle into something much bigger. By the end of the second week, the tow truck driver didn't even need directions anymore. The moment he saw my address on the dispatch screen, he already knew what the situation was. The boat again, he asked the moment he stepped out of the truck. The boat again, I confirmed. By that point the total had reached 7 tows. 7. Most people would have learned their lesson after the first one. Maybe the second. But Mark was stubborn in a way that almost felt impressive. Every time his boat disappeared to the impound lot, he would pay the fee, bring it back, and somehow convince himself that parking it in my driveway again was a good plan. But something changed around tow number 8. That morning, before I even finished dialing the towing company, Mark stormed across the yard toward me. You think this is funny? He snapped. I looked at him calmly. You keep parking on my property. It's just a driveway, he argued. No, I replied. It's my driveway. Mark pointed toward the boat like it was proof of something. You're abusing the towing system. That was new. I raised an eyebrow. You're abusing my property. Mark shook his head angrily. This is harassment. That word made me pause. Harassment, I repeated. Yes, he said. You're targeting me. I almost laughed. You're parking a 20-foot boat in someone else's driveway every day. Mark crossed his arms like he had already won the argument. Well, maybe I'll just report you. For what? For towing my boat. I shrugged. Good luck with that. He stormed back toward his house, clearly furious. But I could already tell something had shifted. Mark had realized he couldn't win by simply ignoring the problem. So now he was trying something different. That afternoon I got the first sign of his new plan. A police car pulled slowly into the neighborhood and stopped in front of my house. The officer stepped out and walked toward my porch. Afternoon, he said. Afternoon, I replied. He glanced toward the empty driveway where the boat had been that morning. I'm responding to a complaint, he said. Let me guess, I said. Boat towing dispute. The officer nodded. Apparently Mark had reported me for illegal towing. I explained the situation calmly. Private property. Blocked driveway. Repeated warnings. The officer listened carefully, then nodded. Sounds like you're within your rights, he said. Across the street, Mark was watching from his window. The officer walked over to speak with him next. The conversation didn't look friendly. And when the officer finally left, Mark looked even angrier than before. Which meant one thing. The boat was probably coming back again tomorrow. And if it did, the tow counter would keep climbing. By the time the boat had been towed 7 times, the entire neighborhood knew about it. Every morning had started to follow the same routine. I would step outside, see the boat blocking my driveway again, make the same phone call, and within half an hour the familiar tow truck would appear. At first, people thought the situation was strange. Then it became entertaining. Neighbors began quietly watching from their windows whenever the tow truck arrived. A few even stepped outside pretending to water their lawns just to see what would happen next. Mark, however, wasn't laughing. Each trip to the impound lot was costing him more money. Storage fees, towing charges, paperwork, it was adding up quickly. And eventually, he decided to fight back. One afternoon, as I was working in my garage, a police car slowly rolled into the neighborhood and stopped in front of my house. The officer stepped out and walked toward me. Good afternoon, he said. Afternoon, I replied. I'm responding to a complaint about illegal towing. I didn't even need to ask who had made the complaint. Boat trailer, I asked. The officer nodded. Across the street, Mark stood in his driveway watching the conversation. I explained everything calmly. It's parked on my driveway every morning, I said. Blocking my car. I've asked him multiple times to stop. The officer walked over to inspect the driveway area, looking at the clear property line between the houses. Then he turned back to me. And the towing company confirmed this as private property. Yes, he nodded thoughtfully. After a moment he walked across the street toward Mark. The two of them spoke for several minutes. From where I stood, I couldn't hear everything, but Mark was clearly frustrated. He pointed toward my house several times. The officer remained calm. Eventually the officer returned to my side of the street. You're within your rights, he said. If someone parks on your private driveway without permission, you're allowed to have it removed. I nodded. Thank you. The officer climbed back into his patrol car and drove away. Across the street, Mark looked furious. The plan he thought would stop the towing had just completely backfired. Instead of getting me in trouble, he had just confirmed that everything I was doing was perfectly legal. That evening I noticed something interesting. Mark kept staring at my driveway like he was trying to solve a puzzle. And the next morning, the boat appeared again, right in the same spot. Which meant only one thing. The tow count was about to reach number 8. And Mark still hadn't figured out the easiest solution to this entire problem. Parking somewhere else. By the 3rd week, the situation had become legendary on our street. Neighbors no longer pretended they didn't know what was happening. Every time the tow truck appeared, people would quietly step outside just to watch the show. Some of them even started guessing the number. Was that number 15 yesterday? One neighbor asked me while walking his dog. 16, I replied. He whistled. Wow, he still hasn't learned. Apparently not. Mark continued bringing the boat back from the impound lot and parking it in my driveway again the very next morning. Each time, the routine repeated. Boat appears. Phone call made. Tow truck arrives. Boat disappears. The towing company drivers had started joking about it too. "You might break our company record," one driver told me while hooking up the trailer. "Record for what?" I asked. "Same boat getting towed from the same driveway." I laughed. "Well, we're not done yet." And we weren't. By the time the count reached 20, Mark had clearly lost patience. One morning he stormed outside before the tow truck even arrived. "You're obsessed," he shouted across the yard. "You keep parking here," I replied calmly. "You could just let it go. It's my driveway." Mark ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're costing me thousands of dollars." "That sounds expensive," I said. "You're doing this out of spite." I shook my head. "No, I'm doing it because you keep blocking my car." The tow truck arrived right on time. Neighbors across the street were already watching. One woman actually brought a folding chair onto her lawn. The driver stepped out of the truck and looked at Mark. "Morning again," he said casually. Mark looked like he might explode. "This is harassment," he yelled. The driver simply started attaching the chains to the trailer. Metal clicked. Hydraulics hummed. The boat slowly lifted off my driveway again. "Number 23, the driver said with a grin. Mark stared at the rising trailer in disbelief. 23 times. 23 towing fees. 23 trips to the impound lot. And somehow, after all of that, he still hadn't stopped. The tow truck began pulling away once again, carrying the massive boat down the street. Neighbors clapped quietly as it disappeared around the corner. Mark stood in the middle of the road, furious and defeated. But what happened next was something none of us expected. Because later that week, Mark tried one final move. And it would end this entire driveway war once and for all. After tow number 23, something changed. For the first time in weeks, the next morning arrived without the familiar sight of the boat in my driveway. I stepped outside slowly, almost expecting it to magically appear again like it had every other day. But the driveway was empty. Completely empty. I stood there for a moment, coffee in hand, waiting. Nothing. No boat. No trailer. No Mark storming outside yelling about towing companies. Just a quiet suburban morning. At first I thought maybe he had simply parked somewhere else for the day. But by the afternoon, the real answer became clear. A moving truck pulled into Mark's driveway. Large cardboard boxes started appearing in his front yard. Furniture followed. A couple of workers carried out chairs, tables, and eventually even the giant fishing equipment that usually sat in his garage. Neighbors began stepping outside again. This time, though, they weren't watching a tow truck. They were watching Mark move out. Tom from across the street walked over to stand beside me. "Guess he finally gave up," Tom said quietly. I nodded. 23 towing fees had apparently been enough to convince him that using someone else's driveway wasn't the best long-term plan. Mark barely looked at anyone as the moving crew worked. He seemed embarrassed, or maybe just exhausted. After a few hours, the workers finally rolled the massive boat trailer down his driveway and attached it to the back of a truck. For the first time since this whole situation started, the boat wasn't anywhere near my property. Mark climbed into his truck a few minutes later. Before leaving, he glanced once toward my house. We made eye contact for a brief moment. He didn't wave. He didn't say anything. He simply started the engine and drove away. And just like that, the driveway war was over. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. No more tow trucks. No more shouting matches. No more giant boat sitting where it didn't belong. A few days later, a new family moved into Mark's house. Friendly people. Normal people. People who understood the basic concept of property lines. And my driveway, it finally stayed exactly the way it was supposed to be. Empty. Looking back at the whole situation, the lesson was actually pretty simple.
Respect your neighbor, respect their property, because if you decide someone else's driveway belongs to you, you might end up paying for that mistake 23 times. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.